Welcome to Checks and Balances. I'm Michael Vincent. This is James Blair. And this week, inflation.
So, Michael, slightly different setting this week. Great to see you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again. This week's topic is a doozy, and it's been keeping me up a little bit, Mike. The idea of inflation, what's going on in the world, potentially our purchasing power going backwards. It's one that impacts everybody with the potential outcomes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And inflation is often bandied around in the media quite a bit as a measure of how things are going, and it's a doomsday headline of what's going wrong quite a bit. And the Reserve Bank have a target to keep that inflation in check, but sometimes due to a few different forces, it can slip out of balance, and that actually negatively impacts some sectors of the economy far more than others. And what we'll do today is just give a quick explanation of that. Keep in mind, though, this is not an economics podcast. I'm not an economist. James is not an economist. Do not adjust your investment strategy based on what people are saying on the internet, especially us.
Yeah, I did have somebody quote to me the other day that they heard something from a Facebook forum, and that was the purpose of us talking about something. So yeah, please get your information from credible sources. And good job, Mike, on the disclaimer. So today, this is something that impacts everybody. You might think you're getting richer, but feel like you're getting poorer. Potentially going forward, that could be what happens. So we're going to talk about what is inflation, what are the targets, what's been going on, and what do we think will happen going forward. And I will keep Mike on a short leash because he laps this stuff up. You love it, don't you?
I do. If inflation keeps James up at night about his purchasing power, arguments about inflation on the internet with economists keep me up at night reading them.
Okay, so I think a really good starting point is, once again, this is an economist podcast. This is the Every Person podcast to improve your financial literacy. Firstly, a really important starting point. What is inflation? So Mike, can you explain to us what is inflation? What does it mean?
Yeah, so inflation is the term used to describe the average price rise of goods in an economy. What that really means for you is the erosion in the value or the purchasing power of your money. It's measured across a CPI, or a consumer price index, which is an average basket of goods that a person might purchase. And they will track that from year to year to year to see how much those prices are increasing by.
Great. Okay. So kind of as an example, if I have $100 of groceries last year and inflation has moved a bit, maybe that same basket of groceries cost me $102 or $103.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some limitations and issues with this measurement. The makeup of that basket of goods can sometimes be an issue. Quite often you'll see inflation at different areas of that basket of goods. Like you might see a decrease in the price of, let's say, consumer electronic goods over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but an increase in the price of necessities, say education or housing and food, something like that, which can sort of skew that measurement a little bit. So although everyone might feel like things are getting more expensive, and economists might be saying, well, actually the inflation rate isn't that bad, there are some hidden things in there that can sort of skew those numbers a little bit.
Great. Okay, that probably leads quite nicely, Mike, into what causes inflation.
Yeah, there's a number of different things that can cause inflation. And when I'm talking about inflation here, I'm not talking about hyperinflation, and that is the really key, I guess, sort of difference to point out here, is that a lot of the times when people talk about inflation in the media, they'll be referring to that hyperinflation. So 1922 Germany post-war, 1945 Hungary, Yugoslavia 1992, Zimbabwe 2007, North Korea 2009, and I think Venezuela was the last one in 2016.
Hold up. I'm not going to let that. That was very impressive.
I love
Was that prepared, or did you just rattle that off?
No. So the reason okay, let me jump on that for a second. Specifically, that those hyperinflation sort of moments in history, or in those headlines in different economies, are really caused by a lot of money being printed into the economy, and then a really large supply side shock. So if we think about the first one in 1922 in Germany post-war, what you've got is the supply side shock, where the Allied forces were occupying a lot of Germany. France was occupying their major production centers and these sorts of things, which meant they couldn't produce goods at a normal rate. So the government was printing money, I think it was the paper mark, to try and just absolutely, prop up the economy. And that eventually leads to hyperinflation. I think in, was it Zimbabwe in 2007, prices were doubling every 15 hours. So that's a really hyperinflation, like crazy, that spells death, doom of the economy sort of thing. Normal inflation, which is an average price rise over time, is really caused by two things. So you have demand side, which is a pull inflation, which means that the people are demanding, there isn't enough sort of supply into the economy. Like, let's say that James and I both want a cup of coffee, and James is willing to pay $2.50 and I'm only willing to pay $2 for it. That is that demand side pull inflation that will cause rises in general prices over time. The flip side of that is cost push inflation, which is when the price of the fundamental goods are getting more expensive. That can be caused by a number of different things. But those are the two sides of things that really cause inflation. There are some other causes of inflation, which are really not specific to this moment in time, but sort of specific to where we are in terms of COVID and the economy. But those are sort of the main things there.
Cool. Okay. And important to point out as well, Mike, that inflation isn't a bad thing if it stays within reason, right? It's a good thing that's kind of chipping away and growing over time.
Yeah, it's completely natural in an economy, and you'll see over time inflation rises, it drops. This is natural cycles of these sorts of things. The reason it can be bad is if you think about let's use an example of where we're at the moment. Okay, so the due to COVID and the slowdown in the economy, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand has been doing what we call printing money, and that is essentially flooding the market with cash to try and stimulate the economy. It's what we call counter-cyclical economic policy or monetary policy. Yeah. I know, right? I love this. So what that means is that they are reducing the they're doing it carrot and stick, right? So they are printing money, so they're giving everyone a lot more money in terms of the bank and those sorts of things, and they're lowering interest rates, and they're lowering their overnight cash rate, which means that banks won't want to store money at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. They'll want to push it out into the economy. So that's sort of the situation we're in at the moment and have been for a little while now. The issue there is, in an economics term, what we say is the velocity of money is also right down. The velocity of money is how often a dollar is spent in an economy in the quarter. So let's say, back to our coffee analogy, James buys his coffee for $2.50 from a coffee shop. That money is then given to the worker in the coffee shop, who goes out and buys some McDonald's with it. That would mean that the velocity of money is 2 for that quarter. Because the velocity of money is so low, people just aren't spending their money. Either they don't have the opportunity to because they're stuck inside, or they're less certain about the future than they usually would be. This velocity of money is usually around 1.5 to 2. At the moment, sitting much lower, around 1. So at the moment, we're pumping the economy full of money. No one's spending that money. We're really just sitting on cash, and the savings rate is going up. If the velocity of money shifts from 1 to 1.5, then real GDP has to increase by 50%, the money supply has to decrease by 33%, or inflation has to increase by 50%. And what is the most likely out of those three things? Probably that the inflation will increase by 50%. Now, a 50% increase in inflation over 12 months is devastating to an economy. 50% increase in inflation over 20 years is completely fine. So that's a really specific example of sort of where we're at the moment. And then you have the other side of that, which is a supply side shock. So you have supply chain disruption due to COVID, which is increasing the cost of goods in New Zealand, for everything from building materials, cars, all sorts of things across the entire spectrum. So you've got a couple of different things that are causing inflation in the market at the moment. And then when inflation starts to get out of control or gets above the sort of 1 to 3% Reserve Bank target, they have to take some action to change that.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and really good summary, Mike. I'm actually quite enjoying this. And actually, I mean, didn't know that much about Yugoslavia. I learned lots.
Yeah. You know what? If I'm sorry to bring math into it, so let's. Here's an example that I heard the other day when I'm talking about the velocity of money and how it's going to affect an economy. So let's say you're blowing up a balloon. And you are just pumping it full of cold air. And let's say that in this example, the balloon bursting is hyperinflation. If you're blowing a balloon full of cold air, it's going to take significantly more air than if it was hot air to blow that balloon up to a point where it burst. Now, let's say you're pumping it full of cold air, but then that air starts to heat up, so that velocity starts to increase. All of a sudden, you've got a lot of air in this balloon, and it's going to pop as it heats up. So that's sort of another way to think about how the velocity of money and money supply can impact inflation.
Awesome. Okay. And then, so if we take it back to where we were March last year, right, when COVID hit, right? So we're all kind of going about our business. There was this thing going around in the world where economies were starting to shut. It was all very scary. We didn't know what was going to happen to house prices. We didn't know what was going to happen to jobs. We didn't know what was going to happen to economies. So there was lots of uncertainty there. And then essentially all governments around the world went, oh crap, like we need people to feel confident. If people don't feel confident in what's happening, then as Mike said, the velocity of money stops. I stop spending money, which stops other people spending money, which is really bad for everybody. So they've started to print money to get things to continue to circulate. But in turn of that, there's the question about how much is too much, right? And obviously the unemployment rate, especially in New Zealand, is looking pretty good, while a lot of people on subsidies, people are still getting a regular paycheck and some sitting on it, which has meant that there's all this money circulating around. There's relatively good employment. And the other interesting thing as well, Mike, especially in New Zealand, right, is house prices have moved 25, 30% over a year. So then you've got this printing of money, plus you've got people feeling wealthier because my net worth has gone up $500,000 over the past 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And the house price increases is probably a whole different topic in itself. In my opinion, it's the problem that the government doesn't really want to fix. But yeah, we can get onto that in another episode. So I guess that's sort of a description of where we're at, how we got here. We've talked about what is inflation, what are some of the drivers, what are some of the extreme examples, and what causes it. Now, I guess the real thing to think about here is, how does this impact you? And what should you be doing about this inflation? Now, astute investors and probably more large institutional investors will know that when there is high inflation in the market, it is better to have debt than cash. And the reason for that is, let's say I take out $1 million worth of debt, and I'm paying it back in today's dollars. I owe them $1 million. Let's say as inflation increases, so does the average wage and all of the other things that go along with it, I'm let's say 10 years in the future, if inflation is high, I'm paying back $1 million in today's debt with $1 million of this inflated future value of a currency, which means that relatively speaking, that $1 million will cost me less. Now, I'm not saying you should go and take out a whole lot of debt just because inflation. You need to think about that very carefully. But that is one of the ways that inflation can perhaps impact the investment markets and some of the ways that these sort of large, astute institutional investors think about it. The second way that this really impacts the market is the most obvious way. The cost of things is going up. Now, over time, wages and inflation generally rise in not lockstep, but in a pretty similar sort of fashion. So what that means is that, let's say over 10 years, the average inflation is 2%. Wages probably generally end up being about 2% increase over that 10-year period as well. Where this really starts to bite, though, is people who are on fixed incomes. So let's say that I am relying on a term deposit for an income. I'm maybe a little bit closer to retirement, or I'm on the pension. Those don't generally tend to move like regular wages in the economy. And that's where it can really start to bite, because their purchasing power is going to come right down, while everyone else's will sort of generally move with inflation over time.
Awesome. And Mike, what do you think will happen to the OCR with this kind of being something that they'll need to take into consideration?
So the official cash rate. So what happens is, because the Reserve Bank has to control or set a target to control inflation, and one of the big drivers of inflation is, if we go back to James wanting to spend $2.50 on this coffee versus me only wanting to spend $2 on this coffee, is they will look to take some of that confidence away from James, so he's not spending so much, or he doesn't have the ability to. So what they will do is they'll increase interest rates on mortgages by way of the official cash rate in the economy. Now, why would they do this, and why is this something that works? If you think about the percentage of our income that we spend on our mortgage, it's a really large percent. So what that means, if the cost of that mortgage goes up, James is spending more on the interest cost than he was, sort of 5 months ago, 2 years ago, which means he has less real money to spend in the economy. That will pull back some of his spending and help to control inflation. Now, there's a couple of issues with raising the official cash rate to control inflation. It has a pretty heavy lag effect on it. Most people are on fixed interest rates, which means that a rise in the official cash rate doesn't really hit the real economy for about 2 years, as people roll off those lower fixed interest rates onto a higher fixed interest rate and have their purchasing power or the amount of money they can spend reduced.
Yeah, that's a really good summary there, Mike. I think there's probably a couple other points in there as well. So just to kind of come back, so the Reserve Bank's job is to try and keep inflation over the long term between 1% and 3%. Inflation over the past 12 months has been about 4.9%. ANZ's predicting it to be 5.8% next year, so quite a bit above that 1 to 3. Although inflation over the past few years has been relatively low. But I think either the quarter or the month, Mike, I was hearing on the news last night, the highest it's been since the 1980s. So it's definitely not a scenario you see every day, which means probably. Sorry.
All I was going to say there is it's not a scenario you see every day. It's also not a scenario that a lot of people in the economy have seen. If you think about first-time buyers, a lot of younger people in the economy that won't have seen this level of inflation for quite some time or experienced it before, so don't really have this concept of what an interest rate at 6% or 7% really looks like.
Oh, terrifying you even saying those numbers. So I guess a couple of things from my perspective. The first one is, obviously, when it comes to, and Mike alluded to this, around your salary and your wages, last year for a lot of people, they wouldn't have got a wage increase because we're still in the middle of COVID. Businesses were trying to retain cash, a lot of uncertainty, right?
Yep.
It probably needs to be having that kind of conversation now. And a great way to lead that conversation is your costs have gone up, and seeing what you can agree with your boss, because essentially if you don't get a pay rise, you've essentially taken a 5% pay cut, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You go.
The second part there as well is thinking about your investment decision. So Mike's spoken about the benefit of debt when inflation happens, but you've also got to be thinking about, geez, if you're in a term deposit at the moment, your money is going seriously backwards. And if you can't tolerate the risk, if you've got a short-term goal, that's fine. But yeah, your money is going backwards quite aggressively. If you're investing in something and not clearing personal debt, just remember that when you're thinking about your real return, which is after costs, fees, cost, tax, and inflation, it's really got to be above working hard for you to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. Michael, the economist, an absolutely stunning performance, definitely MVP of the day. If there's a topic like this you'd like us to talk about, make sure to email us through. We've got some great ones lined up. We've got a listener question around gold, another one around first home buyers that's come through by YouTube. So make sure to send them through. Give us a subscribe, review on Apple and the like, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.